Our next presentation is called Offering It Up, a project exploring object making and object support in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Sophia Smolenski is an independent contract Mountmaker. She's a certified welder who has been working as a Mountmaker and museum technician in New Zealand for the past 12 years. She has worked in public institutions such as Pukearika, the Museum of New Zealand in Te Papa, Tongariro, as well as at private companies that specialize in museum design and production. And I think she gets the award for traveling from the furthest away. So, Sophia?
Okay, just gonna scooch this in here. Hello, everyone. My name is Sophia Smolenski, and I've come here all the way from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And as Brett said, I've been working as a museum technician and Mountmaker for the past 12 years. And over those years, I've been directly employed by museums, and I've worked for a private exhibition production company, and I've also been a contract Mountmaker. And very, very recently, I have been officially employed as a Mountmaker for the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa, Tongariro. Something to note about New Zealand is that there is an active fault line that runs the length of the whole country. So we definitely get earthquakes, and though we are a very small country, we actually have the most museums per capita in the world. So you could say for a small country, there's still a bit of Mountmaking going on. I'm here to talk about something a bit different. I'm here to share a project that I started over 4 years ago. A project where I've been exploring Mountmaking within my own art practice, because like almost every museum technician and Mountmaker I've ever met, I'm also an artist and have a creative practice of my own, even if it's not always a really public one. I realized I kind of wanted to explore what it's like to be in the space, being a Mountmaker, and what would happen if I brought Mountmaking into my art practice in a way that I was effectively treating Mountmaking as my art practice. A starting point for me was to acknowledge that when I would be working with an object in a museum, making a mount for it could be kind of an intimate process, where the longer I would spend with it and the more I'd start thinking about its history and its stories. And I realized sometimes when I'd finished that process, my thoughts and feelings about that object might have changed. So for making these mounts for this project, one of my questions was, if that's how my relationship to objects can change through making mounts for them, then what happens when I'm making mounts for objects that I already have a personal connection with? Like, can I kind of manufacture sentimentality or manipulate it? And can I use this practice to change my relationships to objects in my everyday life? Or what happens when I actually spend time thinking about the objects I might already use every day and not think about? I've documented quite a lot of this project on Instagram, so if you want to see more, you can go check it out there. I could honestly talk about it for hours, so I thought I would just talk about a few things that I haven't shared online and might be of specific interest to you guys. I decided to give myself a framework, and that was to just pretty much make mounts how I would in a museum, so to speak. So not try and do anything really arty or fancy just for the sake of it. So just try and be discreet, hold the object safely, and all of that. I did have a couple of things for aesthetic reasons. I decided to keep just a few different gauges of wire and rod. And I also decided that I wouldn't have any detachable parts to mounts. In general, I mostly work with stainless steel and weld mounts because I can use a piece of wire as small as 0.9 millimeters, and it's still relatively strong and rigid for its size. But as I'm sure a lot of you know, welding that small has its own challenges, especially when you're doing multiple joins on one mount. Here are some photos of a mount I made for my keys. As you can see, there are quite a few joins, so I took my time with that one. Something I think is kind of cool about this is that my keys aren't actually a museum object. So since this mount was made, they've continued to live their life alongside mine, and they have changed a lot, and some of the keys have even been swapped out with others. So in a way, this mount kind of has become a bit of a snapshot in time. I don't know if that video is going to play, yeah, this is a mount that would have been a perfect candidate for a detachable part, but I already said no to doing that. So this was a fun challenge to work out where the mount, I'd have to have the mount and how much tolerance to give so that I could get the object on and off the mount. And this is just a wee video I sent my friend, who was also a Mountmaker at the time, just to celebrate that I'd worked it out. I made a mount for my shoe, and this is where I started creeping out of that original framework, so not just making things how I would exactly for work, because I just saw the tread under my shoe, and it was just too good of an opportunity. I could have placed the mount differently and just had a bunch of straight paths, but then it could have been for anything, and I just liked that moment of it echoing the object, so I did that. And this one, I broke the rules the most. This is a pill packet, and I'm not really sure why, but I really wanted to hold the individual pills. So yeah, that's definitely not how I'd make it for work, but it felt right and just like a natural one to kind of break the rules on a bit. During this time, I thought a lot about mounts I had previously made over the years at work and how we come across similar objects again and again and how naturally we end up designing mounts using similar solutions and paths. Then, in a way, we kind of develop a bit of a language. For example, all plates have different profiles and details, but it makes sense that we follow similar paths. And if I say a plate mount, you all kind of know what I mean. A type of object that over the years I've made many, many mounts for are hei tiki, which are a particular type of Māori carving, usually made and worn as adornment. Here's a quick Google search of some examples. I was reflecting on the many mounts over the years I've made for hei tiki and how each one is obviously incredibly unique in so many ways, but I basically would end up designing the paths as one of 3 different variations. So on reflection of that, I made these 3 mounts for imaginary hei tiki that would follow the 3 paths I was very familiar with. Oh, I might have gone too far. So yeah, by the end of the time I dedicated to make mounts for this project, I'd explored a lot of my own objects, and in the end I had 42 mounts for the next phase. These are just some of them, obviously there's way more. Right at the beginning of this whole project, I thought about how a valuable part of being a mount maker is that we aren't really operating in isolation, so to speak, and that we're always making something in response to an existing object and working with others. So I thought it would be valuable to not explore this completely in isolation and instead to invite others in. So right at the beginning, I invited 22 artists from all over New Zealand to each make an artwork in response to one of my mounts. It was really important to me that I actually go meet each artist in person, especially because most of them I would be meeting for the first time. Like at the beginning, only 3 of these people I'd met in person and I'd kind of had a friendship with. So each weekend for a few months, I travelled to see them. Obviously, there's too much to talk about with that, so I'll just put up some highlights that I thought you guys might enjoy. So yeah, on the left, you can see I embroidered each artist's name onto a pair of white gloves and gave them each a pair, like a bit of an invitation and a little bit of a joke, like, haha, you handle my mounts with like white gloves now, a bit of revenge. And in the middle, you can see a photo of Simon Atwell, who's one of the artists and who is also an art handler. And here he is, wearing his gloves while he signs a memorandum of understanding while we are surrounded by pizza, which all felt really appropriate. And I really loved seeing the way people were selecting which mount they would work with. A highlight was visiting Carl Fitch and Lisa Walker in their studios. And as soon as I unpacked the mounts, Lisa was like, that one. Like, she knew exactly which one she wanted to respond to. And Carl took like a couple of hours, and we were just talking about museum practice and the project and all of that. And he's just sitting there wearing his white gloves and stroking their white cat. And there's just like this accumulating cloud of white cat hair building up in the room. I also think you might find it really funny that one of the artists was, when I met them, was like, oh, so you've just made up these forms and they look like mounts, that's so cool. And I was like, no, I actually made it to fit something specific, like an existing object. And he was like, oh, I thought you just made it up, and I was so impressed by that. And I was like so burnt. I had to explain to him that it was like, no, this is harder, trust me. And Laurie Steer, who's a potter, as soon as he chose his mount, he was like, it's going for a swim. It's time for it to have a holiday after all this hard work. And he literally floated it on its little foam block and pushed it around the swimming pool while playing really loud music. And he said it was okay, apparently, because he was wearing his white gloves. You can also see a spider found the mount immediately, which I thought was quite funny. I have no idea how it got on there. So yeah, not long after visiting the last artist, I started receiving updates from people telling me a bit about what they were making. One of the artists had taken their mount on a 3-day hike and made recordings of sounds they'd made with it. Another artist had told me that they were wanting to make the mount spin in like a music box kind of situation. So I was starting to collect all that information for the next stage, which would be an exhibition. So I was like thinking, okay, it needs power, it needs speakers, and all of that. I then got this incredible update from Jasmine Tejera. She had travelled north to collect water for a video work she was creating and sent me this photo. She was collecting the water from a place that is really significant to her and her ancestors. Here you can see some stills she sent me. Jasmine had chosen to respond to the mounts I'd made, inspired by mounts that I'd previously made for Heitiki. Here you can see she's created a Heitiki by freezing the water she collected and then filming it in real time, slowly melting off the mount. Throughout this project, one of my key considerations was tikanga Māori, which put very simply means considering and respecting the beliefs of Māori, who are the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is a very, very important part of working as a Mountmaker in New Zealand. Respecting and deliberately engaging with a marginalised culture as they navigate how their beliefs can exist and be practiced within a colonial framework, such as a museum. There's a lot of nuance as each individual navigates this for themselves and what it means to them. What that might look like on a more practical level in my job as a Mountmaker is considering that the community who the object belongs to can have beliefs that the objects can embody a person or their ancestors, and therefore it kind of has its own personhood. So like, for example, on the simplest way, like when considering where a mount holds an object, for example, you wouldn't put a mount around the neck of an object portraying a figure. You would also consider the orientation the object is displayed in. For example, like a weapon, it could imply something different depending on whether it's pointing up or down. Sorry, I'll just go back. Of course, this very important aspect of my work felt just as relevant and important when exploring Mountmaking within my own practice and within this project. For example, I didn't want to tell the artists what the mounts were originally made for, so they would be responding to the mount and not the original object. However, I did make a couple of exceptions, taking into consideration that in some way the original object the mount was made for will always be part of the lineage of the work. So if I knew there was anything that I would need to consider to respect Māori beliefs, I would need to be transparent about those things with the Māori artists in this project, such as any objects relating to the body or the land. There we go. Hopefully that goes next. It was once again relevant when Catherine Griffiths put forward her work, which comprised of an archive of her own hair. Of course, this is a material that is literally part of somebody's body, so I knew I would need to talk to the 3 Māori artists whose own individual pieces would be part of this larger work. I think it's important to note that before I even talked to them about it, I realised I needed to take a bit of time and consider that to ask authentically also meant I needed to be prepared to fully follow through with respecting their response. My artistic response and what I would make would need to adapt if their wishes weren't compatible with my original plan. I think navigating these things could be and are often seen as challenges, but I like to think of them as opportunities to take a moment and look at the world through a different set of eyes, and this is one of the main reasons I'm so grateful to do the job I do. In the end, I didn't have to divert from my original plan at all, but all the conversations that were had were so valuable. And here is a bunch of photos of some more works I ended up receiving from artists. In the end, I had a video work, a sound work, 2 works that needed to spin in very different ways. There was hair, there was silver, cow bone, wood, paper, fabric, a plant that had been grown around a mount and then killed, and found objects and silicon. It was time for me to use exhibition making as a medium and contextualize the 22 works within what would effectively be one overall work. I decided I would make a vitrine, which I guess is well-trodden ground, but that's kind of why I chose it. It's a distinct language and icon of museum practice. I decided that all the crates, etc., that would house and transport the work would also be part of the show, because for me it was undeniably part of the work. I got a grant to do this so that I could pay for the materials, and unfortunately the timing of everything meant between receiving the grant money and opening the exhibition, I had 3 months, and I was still needing to work full-time. I managed to take a week off, but everything else was done on lunch breaks, evenings and weekends. I didn't have my own workshop either, so I was using my friend's single-car garage, and as you can see, the steel didn't really fit in there. Made it work. I made a big trolley and all the parts of the vitrine in this garage space. I then hired a larger workshop space by the day and set it all up to make sure it would work. There's me pulling face, great. In theory, I knew this would work, but getting those first 3 sheets of glass on was like such a huge relief. And up until this point, I'd been working in my friend's garage on my own, but obviously I couldn't assemble this by myself, so I called on some friends. I'm very lucky to have had so many people in my life not only help me lift things, like really heavy things, like massive sheets of glass, but also move things around the city and let me use their spaces and, most importantly, feed me. So this was the first time I had the whole vitrine together, and I knew that I'd worked out all my tolerances correctly, which I'm sure all of you know that is often the biggest challenge that goes unseen. Coincidentally, the vitrine is exactly 3 of me long, so in total it's 5.5 meters long by 1.2 meters wide, so that's 18 feet by like 4 feet. I then sent that off to be painted. I decided I really wanted to exaggerate the feeling of the super clean and formal space to a point that was a bit absurd. So I made the crates so that they could be spray painted in a gloss white finish, which took an insane amount of filling and sanding. Like I was taking bits of the crates to work and sanding them in my lunch breaks. And that's me getting them back from the painters and fitting them out. Here they're all back for the painters, and of course they're terribly impractical, but I think that's what's kind of charming to me. And at the end of the day, I'm the one moving them and installing it, so the joke's on me anyway, so I don't feel too bad. Also, there was like the kind of fun being able to do this, but also knowing that you're kind of not, like the paint isn't exactly what you'd be allowed to use at work and like all those things, and just kind of leaning into it. I then received everything back from the painters and assembled it again. This time I was working out object placement and testing the cladding, which I was making for the top and the bottom. Each piece of cladding was going to have to be a very specific size, and I wanted all the markings showing which bits went next to which on the outside, because for once I was not trying to make a place where all the work was hidden, where it wasn't obvious that people had to put this together. For Jasmine's video work, I made a screen housing, and because you could see the back of it, I got it CNC routed on the backs with writing saying hiding all of the bits. Basically, for install, everything was good to go, but it was the first time I got to see it with the lighting on, and I left a surprise under the case, mostly for other museum technicians and Mountmakers who might come in and do the classic thing of checking out under the case. And it's the whole underside is mirrored, and all the cables and inner workings are just fixed on top of that mirror. So it was actually great for installing, because when you're lying on the floor, you can see where all your tools are around you. But yeah, I was hoping somebody would look under and kind of get a fright or something. This is what it looked like in the end. All of the 22 other artists' works that they made in the one vitrine, including the sound work. So the sound work's like kind of playing in there and being a bit like muffled. These are all photos from the work being on display at the Adam Art Gallery in Wellington. All the objects I originally made the mounts for are nested in the same crate as the mounts and all the other artworks that were made, just like they could be companions together. As part of the work, I also printed out what is pretty much almost every email it took to make this project to this point. This is my friend Millie having a quick flick through the stack of emails. I've often told people metaphorically that if I'm the object, Millie is the mount. Millie has supported me through so many things I've done, especially this project. Millie's helped me write grant proposals and has even come all the way to Boston with me. So yeah, I want to acknowledge that with this project, I didn't just think a lot about the support structures like mounts, but I also thought a lot about the social support structures that are necessary for cool things to happen. Like the community I built around this project is really what it was about. And as we know, objects and exhibitions don't just appear in the gallery out of nowhere, and all of these networks of people in place are there to make those things happen. And I also think it's important to acknowledge those people supporting those people. Basically, working as a Mountmaker so far has taught me that working together, supporting each other as we keep looking at the world with new eyes and sharing knowledge is really cool. And we all have the ability to actively build communities that do that. And from what I can tell, the International Mountmakers Forum is doing a damn good job at that. So thank you very much for having me. I don't know, do we have time for questions?
We'll have questions. So I was told just before Sophia did her presentation that we've lost our internet, so all the questions will just be in here. So sorry if we're watching virtually, you're going to miss out on one of the coolest talks we've had so far. So all
Brett?
the questions will be in here.
Sorry, we're actually back on.
We are back
and
on?
I have a question.
Okay,
Very
I'll take
quick,
it all back.
yes.
Welcome back, everybody.
All right, Sophia. So, what are some attributes of an object that draw you in and inspire you to make a mount for it?
I don't know about the drawing in thing, but I definitely feel like you meet the object and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, we're going to have to work together on this. Or like, you know, sometimes you'll spend quite a bit of time solving the problems and the object will really make your life tough, and then at the end you're kind of just like, yeah, like. I definitely think one of the things I think about the most is how so many of the mounts that I end up making, like objects I end up making mounts for, are things that are usually held in people's hands. And that becomes quite an obvious pattern for me, and I think it's really interesting to think about mount making often trying to replace like us as people, like the body holding things. So yeah, I think about that a lot in my immediate thoughts with objects. I don't know if that answers the question though.
Thank you.
I have a question while we wait for more questions. What did the artists think ultimately after the fact when they saw the cart that has the original objects in it? Were they surprised what the original mounts were for?
Yeah, and to be honest, the demigods of coincidence were really messing with us. There were so many connections between, I mean, you can find connections everywhere, that's kind of how it works, right? But there were some really blatant connections between the objects the mounts were originally made for and then the works that the artist had made. Like the one person who made a sound work literally chose the mount that was for my iPod Shuffle.
Wow.
And like one of the mounts was for my granddad's pipe, which had like a little chain. And one of the main conversations I had with Jennifer Larissy, who was the artist who chose that mount, was about how my granddad was a welder and her grandfather was a jeweler, and how that kind of might have influenced us. And then she made a brooch that had a chain that was almost identical in length and look to the pipe, and she would have never seen that. So it was just like, honestly, like half of them, there were uncanny connections. So yeah, but everyone was really surprised.
Do you consider yourself artist first or Mountmaker first, or is it one and the same for you?
That's a really hard question to answer. I don't know. I even find it weird calling myself an artist, but I've kind of started to think more about it in the way of like, you know, when people say the corny thing like everyone's an artist. I think it's just a way to think about how we're looking at the world. So yeah, I feel like that's a really hard one to answer, but kind of an interesting way to interpret that question is somebody asked me whether I'm going to continue to make like Mount-themed artwork or like keep exploring Mount making in my art practice. And I was like, probs not. But I think what's happened is now everything I've learned through doing this work has just come back into my actual job and my work. So it's kind of that, it's like a reverse flow, yeah.
What would you say was the most challenging mount for you to make for this project, and what surprised you the most?
What do you mean by what surprised me the most?
That is an online question, so
okay.
I am not able to elaborate.
Okay, I'll start with the first bit. Anyway, yeah, what was the hardest one to make? I definitely think the ones for my keys, just because I was TIG welding that, and that was like 0.9 of a millimeter of wire, and if you've done that before, you know that's not a fun time necessarily all the time. So I just took my time with that one, and obviously it was like making a mount for like multiple objects and then trying to make that all work together. It was still fun though. It was just really challenging in the way of just knowing that with everything I learned so far that I just needed to like step by step pace myself. And the one for the drill that I pointed out was definitely like, I was pretty chuffed with that, but yeah.
I have another quick question, actually. So, since you've done this project, are you thinking differently about how you make mounts for work?
I think it's definitely re-grounded me on the reasons why I do it. And, yeah, do I make mounts differently? I don't think in a technical way at all differently, but yeah, I think it's definitely, I think a lot more about how like the real value comes from actually like learning about the objects and learning about the people around those objects, and that's in the past and also now, and the relationships we build working with other people. And so I think I've just basically focused my attention a lot more on those things. Yeah.
So when you were finished with the original the mounts for the original objects, did you have like conservation or anybody sign off on it? Or did you just decide when it was done?
It was just me. It was just me. Like, I think as well, funny, like, because this is entirely just outside of my work. For context, I was sleeping in a shed the whole time I made these mounts. Like, I traveled south of New Zealand to my friend's place. He lives in a big shed in the middle of nowhere. There's a population of 20 people in his town, and we're like 45 minutes from the closest like dairy or like 7-Eleven. And he just has this massive shed, and part of it was a metal workshop, and the other part joinery, and then the other part was like kitchen, bathroom kind of situation. And I was like, can I come down and like use your setup and just stay with you so nobody distracts me for a few weeks? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, cool, got somewhere for me to sleep? And he goes, yeah, there's like a cupboard we could probably fit a single mattress. And I was like, sweet, I'm sorted. And I literally just went down there, and I was meant to be there for 4 weeks, and I was there for 6 because we had another lockdown. And I just like slept in a cupboard in a shed and just made up the rules. Like, it was awesome.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sophia, and thank you for sharing this amazing story.